Now, I would argue that despite the lack of U.S. engagement in Africa, the moment right now is Somaliland's, and the future is increasingly looking bright for Somaliland. Now, we heard about international law and legal arguments about Somaliland, but again, if I can be honest, most Americans in Washington don't particularly care about international law. It's much more of, a European obsession. And it's also fair to say that when it comes to international law, most people who quote international law will quote it in such a way that they forget that the very basis of law is about argument and precedent, and there's seldom one interpretation of international law. That said, I find Somaliland's legal case to be compelling. And even if one doesn't want to look at the 1960 independence as the precedent, the fact that Somaliland, unlike many other would-be independent states, has actually had its borders determined by treaty over the past 100 years is important. But let me move beyond international law. When I say that the moment is Somaliland's, it's not just because of the positive aspects of Somaliland, it's because, unfortunately, of where the rest of the region is going. If I can be so blunt, it appears that both Somalia and Ethiopia are unraveling. In Somalia, and both countries, of course, may have this unraveling catalyzed or exacerbated by forthcoming elections. In Somalia, I would argue that one of the reasons why Somalia is unraveling is because of the mistaken approach of the United States and some other members of the international community. There was a belief, and this has been underlying the strategy of our current ambassador, Donald Yamamoto, that the way to rebuild Somalia from its post-Siad Barre state failure is to actually channel resources through Mogadishu. And through the channeling of resources in Mogadishu, build up patronage, which then the leader in Mogadishu, the president in Mogadishu, could use in order to consolidate control over the country. Unfortunately, that sort of strategy has had the opposite effect because it has greased some of the corruption, and some of that money which was meant to contribute to the counter-terror fight appears to be applied more to countering political opponents than to actually fighting al-Shabaab. We can talk about that more in questions and answers. Suffice to say, we've seen with yesterday's announcement of the unilateralism of some of the forthcoming elections, with some states simply not participating, that it's not hard to see that there is going to be some serious political disputes in the future, and those political disputes could turn military. With regard to Ethiopia, we also have the situation with regard to Tigray. One of the things I worry about, I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past. And admittedly, my critics would say I only get that right 50% of the time. But what I worry about when it comes to Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia is that many of the people who come in as reformers, not just in Africa, but we've seen this in Africa repeatedly, will transform into something other than reformers. We've seen this with Isaias in Eritrea. We saw this with Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and so forth. Power can be addicting, and crises can be self-sustaining. Now, while a real argument can be made that the ethnic federalism of the 1995 Constitution in Ethiopia was not the solution for Ethiopia, the fact of the matter is, to unilaterally abrogate that Constitution isn't the process through which the situation can be resolved. There's legal ways to resolve that. And when we see military moves into Tigray, unfortunately, when one opens that door, it's very easy for other states to get involved. It's very easy to create take what appears to be a quick victory and not recognize that you're setting the stage for a long-term, low-intensity conflict, which is going to erode Ethiopia economically at a time when Ethiopia is already facing some serious economic troubles. We also have transitions looming in Eritrea, although no Eritrean would want to talk about that. Isaias is quite elderly, and he's rumored to have had a stroke, I believe, last April. Regardless, there's going to be a day when Isaias doesn't wake up. And then the question is his son popular enough with the military in order to consolidate control? Would other states interfere in Eritrea? And there's any numbers of other possibilities. So Eritrean stability is up in dispute. Sudan, of course, is undergoing a political transition. In my view, it's a positive political transition, but it's far from certain that that political transition is going to be able to solidify in a way where we know what Sudan is going to look like 10 years from now. South Sudan, one doesn't even need to, I mean, the situation is known to all of you. Now, when we look at that and we compare it, we juxtapose it with Somaliland. Somaliland is a clear success, and it's been one since 1991. While elections might be destabilizing in Ethiopia, simply because there's no real opposition at this point in time, and in Somalia, because there's too much opposition at this point in time. In Somaliland, in all likelihood, the elections are going to go smoothly, and it's going to be a good news story. Now, this is where the stars might align again for the United States and Somaliland. Washington is a very cynical place. And oftentimes, when the situation, I mean, American diplomats and American officials like to claim credit for everything that's good and avoid blame for everything that goes wrong. And most of the things we claim credit for have nothing to do with us. I mean, we have a new president every 4 or 8 years, and every president will claim that what happens during those 4 or 8 years is because of them. It's not true, but it's a fiction that most Americans live under. Well, what we often find is that when problems occur, American officials will try to find a good news story and attach themselves to it. So, for example, if we look back at the Horn of Africa just about 8 years ago, it was against the backdrop of chaos in Libya and the tragedy of the American consulate in Benghazi. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was looking for a success story because people were starting to criticize her, and she had, at that time, presidential ambitions. They were starting to criticize her as someone who hadn't achieved anything as Secretary of State. And so she turned to Somalia. And the development of the transitional government in Somalia and really attached herself to it. So too did Secretary of State John Kerry, her successor, when he made his 2015 visit to Mogadishu. Well, if you have problems in Somalia, if you have problems in Ethiopia, what better way, if you're a politician, to show that the United States is still able to have success stories than actually become more involved with Somaliland? Now, against this issue, if Somalia does enter a period of chaos as these elections approach, Yamamoto's strategy of centralizing all assistance is probably going to be revised. Yamamoto is nearing retirement. I don't know when he will retire, but I suspect it will be soon after the elections. And when you have new, fresh faces who are looking at the region, they might say the strategy we tried for the last 5 years hasn't worked. So let's try a much more regional approach, one that, again, Somaliland can take advantage of. More broadly, I just want to highlight that while the United States isn't fully interested in the Horn of Africa right now, that the Red Sea region is a region which the United States is increasingly involved in, at least in a naval capacity, and which we're not ready to ignore. In 2018, according to the Energy Information Agency of the United States, 6.2 million barrels per day of oil went through the Red Sea, went through the Bab el-Mandeb. Much of that was, about 40% of that was heading onwards to the Suez Canal. The other 60% was actually traffic going the other direction. Now, while in Washington, we often, and in Europe, environmentalists often talk about divorcing ourselves from fossil fuels, the simple fact is if you look at a world map and you draw a circle around India and China, more people live within that circle than live outside that circle. And when you consider the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, you have a return to a dependence on fossil fuels and a turn away from nuclear energy and some other alternative energies. And because of that, this maritime trade and these sea routes are going to remain crucially important. If we want to look more further, $700 billion worth of goods get shipped through the Red Sea annually. And so this, of course, is a trade that isn't going to be ignored and is going to maintain that U.S. naval presence in the region. And again, I come back to the key, I think, for the United States to become more involved in the Horn of Africa, and specifically Somaliland, is the U.S. Navy. And that goes, again, into the issue of Berbera. It also economically involves the corridors, which need to be talked about. I find it regretful that China competes for influence in Africa. India does. Turkey and Iran do. Taiwan is. And yet the United States is absent without leave, given, cynically speaking, the economic potential of Africa. Over the last 20 or 30 years, more than 2 billion people have been lifted out of abject poverty. They've been lifted out of poverty in East Asia, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in Africa by an embrace generally of free market capitalism. The economies across Africa have boomed. And the corridor, given the population of Ethiopia, given the strategic importance of the Horn of Africa, the corridors into the interior of Africa are going to be hugely economically important, and that's something which the United States might be late to the game on, but isn't going to forever escape our attention. Lastly, I'll just highlight, of course, the great power competition. China is, every conversation with serious strategic thinkers in Washington involves China and the threat from China. Honestly, personally, I'm more worried about the decline of China than I am about the rise of China. And when I say that, it may seem counterintuitive, but because of the one-child policy which occurred for decades in China, they're nearing a demographic precipice where their population is aging. Demographically, they're not going to have as many young people who are going to be able to replace them. That's going to create economic strains, and so I worry about China lashing out militarily in order to cover its economic decline. At the same time, Russia, I don't see as, it tries to be an actor in this region. I don't see it as much of one. And India, I see, as with Taiwan, to be a very positive actor. The Taiwan move, by the way, which the establishment, the exchange of offices and relations between Taiwan and Somaliland is incredibly important. It's great news. I wrote this before I realized our Taiwanese friends were going to be here. So this is sincere. It's not me being diplomatic because I'm not. It's hugely important, hugely appreciated, and I think it really also changes the dynamic and it catches the attention not only of the United States but other democracies. And so I would certainly hope that the Biden administration will do all that's necessary to keep that relationship on track and support its expansion. With that, I've laid out a number of different issues, but just to summarize it, the dark clouds on the horizon is I see a great deal of instability coming to the Horn of Africa. The silver lining is that Somaliland is going to be an exception to that. The question then becomes, can the United States recognize the opportunities which are presented in a proactive way, or are we going to wait until act more reactively? In deference to our British friends, let me just end by quoting Winston Churchill and what he said about the United States. Of course, what he said is the United States always does the right thing. They just try everything else first. So hopefully we can defy Winston Churchill's logic there as we move forward in our relationship. And with that, thank you very much.